In this lecture, I will learn how easy it is to publish the event to a SNS topic from within our Lambda function. To do that, we will loop through this list and then we will fire an event for each, or we'll fire a message out for each event. Before we go ahead and do that, define a new object. Amazon SNS is the object that we need to access SNS. Amazon SNS, call it SNS is equal to Amazon SNS client builder dot default client will give us the SNS object. Now go inside this try catch block, loop through the events we have, patient checkout events dot for each, and in here call each event as checkout event. Use the Lambda function, use SNS dot publish. The SNS publish can take the topic ARN, as you can see here, and then the string message. How do we get the ARN? Already in the template.amal file, we have defined the environment variable, which will give us the ARN of the topic as an environment variable. So we need to access that environment variable using system.getEnv. Right here you can use system.getEnv within double quotes as a parameter for that. You can grab the name from the template.amal. Patient checkout topic is the key. Paste it and we'll get the ARN of it and runtime. And the message itself is this checkout event that we are getting. And this guy should be converted to a string. Right now it is an object. So you use object mapper dot write value as string and pass in the event. Let me take this to the next line so that you can see it better. Take out the bracket right there and take out the value and add an additional bracket right there. Save it. It will throw some exceptions. Obviously hit Control 1. You can add the try catch or surround it around try catch, and we'll handle the JSON processing exception. Hit Control D. That's it. To publish a SNS message, you create the Amazon SNS object and then use it to publish. We are dynamically reading the topic name, which we have exposed out as an environment variable when the topic gets created during the stack creation. Once we get the ARN of the topic itself, we convert each object that we receive. In the list, we have two objects, if you remember from the logs. We have patient Bharat and patient Sharath. So we are going to fire those individual events as individual messages to SNS.